Welcome. Hi, I'm Mikki, and this is Wikipedia, where I sit down and chat to doctors, professors, athletes, practitioners, and experts in their fields related to health, nutrition, fitness, and well-being. And I'm delighted that you're here. Hey everyone, it's Mikki here. You're listening to Wikipedia, and this week on the podcast, I speak to Dr. Charles Price, or Chad, about bone health. Dr. Price is an orthopedic surgeon who was driven to find solutions when his mother broke her hip and subsequently died, and when both his wife and sister were diagnosed with osteoporosis. This led him down the path of researching nutrition compounds beyond calcium that allowed the bone to be resilient and dynamic. And that's the structure of the bone that provides flexibility, resilience, and toughness. So today on the podcast, we speak about this nutrition compounds, and in addition to that, discuss the utility of using DEXA for determining bone health. And Dr. Price has some really great views on that stuff as well. So we do like quite a big picture on bone health that goes far beyond calcium. Of course, we discuss the utility of those calcium supplements, but also really hopefully you get the idea that it is way more than just calcium that we need to be concerned about. Dr. Charles Price is a pediatric orthopedic surgeon and faculty member of the orthopedic residency program at Orlando Health. He is a professor of orthopedic surgery at Florida State University College of Medicine and has authored or co-authored over 60 scientific research papers. And he has a book as well, and I've got a link to the book in the show notes. Dr. Price is also a certified sports nutritionist by the American Sports and Fitness Association. I'll pop a link to Dr. Price's book, as I said, in the show notes, and where you can find more information on Dr. Price and the supplement that we discuss in the podcast. Just a reminder though, before we crack on into the interview, the best way to support the podcast is to hit the subscribe button on your favourite podcast listening platform. This increases the visibility of the podcast out there in amongst the literally thousands of other podcasts, so more people get the opportunity to learn from the guests, such as Dr. Price, that I have on the show, because there's such a wealth of information. All right, team, let's head into the interview with Dr. Charles Price. Okay, great. I love it. I didn't know that Chad was short for Charles. Actually, I knew an American Chad when I was at university.
It's not. I'm probably the only Charles Chad in the world. My parents had a friend named Chad, and my father's name was Charles. So to avoid confusion, they named me, I have my father's name, but they call me Chad.
Oh, oh, that's great.
It's been a constant source of confusion.
Yeah, I can imagine. So, Chad, Dr. Price, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me today. And I'd just like to start by getting you to tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Certainly. Well, I'm an orthopedic surgeon, and I've always been interested in bones my whole life. My mother was a registered dietitian, and so I grew up with awareness of, proper diet. I didn't always follow her advice, but we talked about nutrition a lot at home, and I just took it as a part of everybody's life to have a balanced diet. And then I didn't really think about it much until two things happened almost simultaneously. My mother and my wife were both diagnosed with osteoporosis. My mother, very severe osteoporosis, and actually she died after a hip fracture. So I didn't want that to happen to my wife. And and I thought, well, gee, I'm supposed to be a bone expert. And orthopedic surgeons have largely not been a part of the osteoporosis prevention aspect. And so I was doing some research work with some bone graft materials and bone growth. I've had an academic career and published over 100 papers, and so I have a research background as well as a clinical background. And there was a type of bone graft that was working better than others that's called a silicated bone graft substitute. It's an artificial bone graft that had a silicon component to it. And actually, during my early training, there was something called bioglass that was developed at the University of Florida when I was a resident. So I was aware of silicon as a potential bone graft healer. That got me interested in silicon and its potential for helping bone. And from there, I got into the nutritional aspects of bone that have been overlooked. It just sort of hit me out of the blue that it was an ignored field for many, many aspects of bone health. Vitamin D was becoming much more known at the time. So a number of things happened together in the later stages of my career that made me aware that, what builds bone? How does bone form? How does bone remodel? What makes it do that? And I just developed a curiosity for nutritional aspects of bone healing, bone formation, osteoporosis, all of those things that were just made me real curious.
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting you say that because I speak to a lot of people about bone health and healing. And of course, we've known forever that dairy, it provides calcium, so important for bones. And that is probably that, plus, as you said, vitamin D, those are the two nutrients which people often think about with bone health and we just don't have, well, the general population doesn't have a really good understanding or awareness of other nutrients. So I get a lot of worried people, for example, when they have to remove dairy from their diet for a food intolerance reason, and they're really concerned about their bones. But then, Chad, like there are populations where they've never consumed dairy yet don't necessarily have issues with poor bone health. How do we sort of explain that?
Why so many people have poor bone health? Is
Or at
that the
least,
question?
if you don't consume dairy, but you can still have good bones, like Asian populations, for example.
Right. Well, that's a great question because epidemiologically, or looking around the world, there are definitely areas that don't have as many fractures as others, and that leads you to say, well, what's in the soil, what's in the food, what's in the diet that protects them more so than others. First of all, I want to say that I'm not selling any products. I don't have any financial interests. It's just an academic curiosity. I've published a few papers, but it's a joy to hear and talk about nutrition. But those things I've also, really looked at the literature of those, and there are definitely some things that happen. Another feature of fractures is the shape of our bones. Some people, if you look at the hip, for example, the hip joint, the ball sticks out from the shaft a little bit, and that's called the neck. It's attached to the neck. Well, someone with a long neck is going to be more likely to break than someone with a short neck. So there are some factors that may reduce the risk of fracture. So with regard to vitamin D and calcium, that was the first thing that struck me, is that all of the bone health literature, the osteoporosis literature, and all those things that we talk about are directed more at the calcium content of bone. And vitamin D helps mineralize bone, and bone is mineral. And we think of a cow, if you go out into the wilderness or into a field, you'll find some bones, and they're calcium, and they're dry, and they're hard. But what they're lacking is the protein. And as I've been very involved in bone growth and bone health, and I really think that the neglected part of bone health has been the protein part of bone, which is collagen, like the collagen in your hair, skin, and nails. And people with osteoporosis tend to have brittle hair and brittle skin and brittle nails, which are collagen.
Yeah.
And if you take a wishbone, for example, you know what a wishbone is, right? They have
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
wishbones in New Zealand, I'm sure. And you break it and make a wish. Well, you have to dry it first. But if you take that same dried wishbone and soak it in vinegar for 3 or 4 days, it'll become rubbery because the vinegar takes all the calcium out of it. It's a fun thing to do, and you can take the calcium out of the bone, and the protein or the collagen is left. It's very rubbery, and you can't break it. So bone has resilience properties. Children actually have a lower bone density than adults do, but they don't break because they bounce. Their bones bend. So it's not just about the calcium content. And that was what was the focus of my study and research, in that the DEXA scan, which is used to measure osteoporosis, is simply a measure of the calcium content of your bone. And the calcium content of a piece of chalk is quite high. And you can you can pick up a bone from the field and go and x-ray it, and you can see the calcium in it. And you can do a DEXA scan on that. But it's much more brittle.
So, Chad, because I recently got a DEXA scan done because I broke my fibula bone earlier this year when I was running up a mountain, and I did this very unremarkable yet slammed half of my body onto my leg, basically. It was on loose ground, and I did a very good fracture on it. And so I got a DEXA scan to have a look at the state of my bones, in addition to a couple of x-rays to see how the healing has sort of gone over the last 5 weeks. So when you get a DEXA scan then, you're getting a marker of the calcium in the bones, but how would you measure can you measure the protein content or the health of the bone in general?
There are some methods developing that can show the bone structure, the lattice work of bone. And one interesting thing is, the inside of your bone is kind of spongy.
Yes.
And it's connected by a network of lattices. And when women's bones become less dense, the connecting little particles of the lattice, the spongy part, they get thinner and thinner and thinner until they break apart. And they might be thick at the end, but they pencil down. Whereas men seem to lose their bone density globally. So the lattices stay intact more often than women do. And so there's a difference in the way the bone is absorbed in women and men. So a lot of those things, the spongy bone, and basically there are some ways, but there's not really a good way to measure the elasticity of your bone or the flexibility of your bone, what's called the resilience or the toughness. So some bones, some women have very low bone density, but they don't break. And men can have low bone density and not break because their bones may be resilient. And so my interest was improving bone resiliency and resistance to fracture. To get a little ahead of things, women that take vitamin K2, 100 micrograms a day, have a lower fracture rate than women that don't. And yet the bone densities can be the same. So if you give the same DEXA scan level, the same calcium content, somebody who takes a supplemental vitamin K2 will have fewer fractures than someone that doesn't. So it's not all about density.
Well, that's interesting because I definitely want to get into the details of what's important for bone and what places someone at risk, and you've just mentioned one of those potential sort of risk factors. With regards to the prevalence of osteoporosis or osteopenia, has this been increasing over time, Chad? Since your research sort of career?
Well, it's really, really prevalent, as you know, in Western cultures in particular. In the world, it's about 10% of women older than 50, and 20% over 60, 40% over 70. So it's pretty high. And I looked up New Zealand, and New Zealand has 1.6 million people with osteoporosis older than 50. And so it's very prevalent, particularly in New Zealand.
And is there any reason for that sort of geographical difference?
Well, obviously nutrition is a big factor, but many factors aren't understood. I have an opinion that's not based in fact.
Yeah,
but
that's okay.
But my particular interest has been in silicon, and maybe we could talk about silicon a little bit. A lot of our water management systems take silicon out of our water because silicon causes calcification of the pipes. And early breast implants were silicon capsules. There was, silicon. Anyway, they had a silicone Silicone is a plastic kind of thing made out of silicon, and it's silicone rubber, silicone, but that's not silicon. Silicon is the mineral, is the actual element. But the silicone capsules for breast implants would cause calcification around the capsule. So silicon has an effect in bone healing. And we take it out of our water in most Western countries. Rural people don't have as much fractures. Areas of the world with higher silicon content in their water have lower risks of fracture and lower risk of osteoporosis. So you could name one element that would help would be silicon. It's in some fruits, it's in bananas and things like that, but it's not very absorbable. Silicon dioxide or silicon, if you look at a nutritional supplement and it says silicon oxide, then that's a rock. Silicon dioxide is glass or sand or granite. That's 2/3 of it's the second, it's the Earth's crust is granite. That's silicon dioxide. And I do get a little annoyed with multivitamin makers who say they've got 2 milligrams of silicon in their product, but when you look at the label, it says silicon oxide or silicon dioxide. Well, you might as well eat a grain of sand.
Well, that's interesting because a lot of the magnesium supplements are like magnesium oxide, and they're attached, and similarly, very hard for us to absorb.
Zinc oxide, most of the oxides are rocks. They're easy to put in a pill, but if you do a quantitative analysis, they can prove that it's in there, but you don't digest it. But the most available sources of silicon in our diet are from certain waters. We could talk about that, and from beer. You might like that.
Yeah. So, were you, like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how delighted were you to discover that beer was a available source of silica?
Well, the hops, the process of brewing hops, and the hops and the barley and beer, and silicon is in nuts and grains and things like that, which we don't eat enough of. But so you can get it from oatmeal and barley and grains and green beans and things like that. But the beer, even the non-alcoholic beer, has a higher silicon content. But so that's how we find it. But the silicated bone graft substitute was what got my attention, and silicon was in the bone graft. What happens? Can I get a little scientific or not?
Please do. I'd love it.
Okay. Well, so why silicon? There's actually a study done in 1970 by a lady at UCLA, and for some reason I've forgotten her name, or Edith Carlisle. Edith Carlisle was a PhD at UCLA who said that bone won't form without silicon. And her research was overlooked until, I don't know, the mid 1990s. But she showed that silicon was essential for bone formation. Now, silicon, you can do a mineral content of our bone and we get calcium, but there's no silicon in it. But what happens is in the forming bone, there's lots of silicon. There's 25 times more silicon in forming bone than there is in mature bone.
So is this including bone which is healing? Like,
yes.
Is that what you mean by forming bone? Or, okay, but also, of course, young bone as well.
Young bone.
Like growing children.
Yes.
And, yeah, cool.
And if women that have been in osteoporotic laboratory animals that have been fed a silicon-based diet get better bone. And they've done that with racehorses too. They put silicon in the diet of racehorses when they're growing. And they found that they have fewer injuries, more track time, better training, better compression. So most of the thoroughbreds now have a silicon supplemented diet. But because they have fewer fractures, racehorses can develop a fracture on the track. And but so what silicon is so silicon's in the premature bone. We've known for a long time that if you compress bone, like exercise is good for bone formation, because it's been shown that when you put stress on bone, it releases a negative electrical charge. And that negative, it's a crystal, so it creates an effect that releases a negative electrical charge. And that negative charge attracts the calcium ion because calcium is positive. Calcium is a positive ion. So the negative electrical charge that's generated from exercising and compressing bone builds bone by attracting calcium. So where does that electrical charge come from? Well, silicon's used in computers as a silicon's used in computers because it's a switch, and it's called a piezoelectric effect. That silicon can release a negative electrical charge. So in forming bone, you have higher content of silicon. If you exercise it, it generates a negative electrical charge, which attracts the calcium, and then it's done its job. Once the calcium is bound to the protein, then the silicon goes away. So you don't see any silicon in mature bone, or very little. So it's like a catalyst that brings calcium to the bone along with exercise.
So with regards to someone who might have osteopenia or osteoporosis, for example, in my DEXA, I had one of my hips is fine, the other one has osteopenia, my spine has got osteopenia. Taking something like silicon, in addition to potentially other minerals and having other good things for bone, that could enhance its, I could actually change what I might see on a DEXA scan in a year, 2 years, 3 years' time?
Yeah, I think you would improve the toughness of your bone and you would improve the quality of your bones, because silicon also it strengthens the bonds of the protein. It couples the protein in your bone better and strengthens collagen. Women that take a silicon supplement also have differences in their nail, skin, hair, and wrinkles. So there's a cosmetic reason to take silicon. And a lot of the cosmetic ointments and things have silicon in them. Bamboo is a rich source of silicon. So you'll see a lot of products that have bamboo because silicon can improve the hair, skin, and nails because it improves the strength of the collagen or the protein in the bone.
So that would be topical. So you could, and this is not bone related, but for example, skin related, looking for a product that had silicon that you apply topically could also benefit your skin, or things like that.
Yeah, most of those wrinkle reduction creams have their bamboo, or they're something that has their coconut oils. Coconut is rich in silicon, and so the coconut oils, the bamboo type things, a lot of those creams, they probably don't know that they're putting silicon in it, but silicon's what's doing it. And so the high-end ones all have some kind of a silicon base to them. But the water is the best way to get it if you're not a beer drinker. But so the waters that have silicon in them are largely waters through volcanic soils, which surprised me a little bit about New Zealand, because I think it's mostly volcanic, isn't it?
Yeah. We've got volcanoes everywhere. But of course, our water then, the water that we drink is filtered of things, and potentially you were talking before how silicon would be one of the things they might remove.
Yeah. So if you had a bottled water from New Zealand, maybe there's a local bottled water, but Fiji water, Icelandic, Evian, those waters have silicon content because they haven't been filtered out. And there's some others too. I just, like I said, I don't have a financial interest in it, but and you don't have to drink a lot. A cup of Fiji water a day is enough. There are probably some local waters that are bottled at the source, and you can look online. If it's a bottled water at the source, you can look online and see what the mineral content of those waters are. And you can find out Perrier doesn't have any silicon in it. Some waters do, some waters don't. But
yeah. And so, Chad, I have to say, I was delighted when I found out that beer had silicon in it, because I love a craft beer. How much beer would you have to drink in order to get your dailies?
Not much.
Your day's worth?
Yeah.
Not much.
Not much. No, it doesn't take much. Yeah, it doesn't take much silicon. Probably, 3 or 4 beers a week.
That's reasonable and moderate.
Yeah. Another of my sort of favorite flags to wave, if you will, is that vitamin D and calcium are sort of the low-hanging fruit. They're obviously associated with bone health, and they're essential. But when we do research, we isolate all the other variables. And so you'll give a group vitamin D, and you'll give a group not vitamin D. And then you show that the vitamin D is better. Well, then you think, oh, this is the magic button, but that's the only nutrient they looked at. And and nutrition, as you know, is a symphony of things, and they work together. So there's not a single bullet, and silicon is not the magic bullet to prevent osteoporosis any more than vitamin D is the magic bullet. It all has to work together. The vitamin D produces something called osteocalcin, which is the binding unit for calcium to bone, and vitamin K improves the quality of osteocalcin. Some boron, which is in nuts and fruits. Boron doubles the half-life of vitamin D, so it makes it last longer. And it enhances bone formation, and we don't get enough boron. We don't get enough silicon. There are a lot of those minor things that we don't get enough of, and they're hard to put in a vitamin supplement. Some of them, like boron oxide, calcium oxide, silicon oxide, they're easy to put in a single capsule. But if you start getting an absorbable form, it's a much bigger molecule, so you got to take 10 pills of boron citrate or something.
Oh, that's interesting, because I have because this is how I came across your research, actually, because of my bone. I'm like, right, I'm going to do everything I can to help the healing process, and I'm taking a million different things, including boron, silicon, collagen, vitamin D/K2, and which actually I was thinking as well, Chad, that in New Zealand we don't during winter we don't get those UVB rays that help us synthesize vitamin D.
Sure.
But not very many people are on a vitamin D supplement, so I wonder, that could potentially influence what we see in the statistics of osteoporosis too, potentially.
Well, that's an excellent point. And the question is always, can I get it through my diet? I've lived this long without taking a supplement, so what's wrong with that? But a healthy diet is the fundamental thing, with lots of fruits and vegetables, and we don't get enough nuts and dried fruit. But boron is in nuts and dried fruit. So if you're eating prunes and other things, then you may not need a boron supplement. But and you don't want to overdo the supplements. There's no need to, but you were saying that those things, I do think that supplements can help. And vitamin D is perhaps the most obvious supplement because we really don't get enough. And vitamin D has so many other properties that it's shown that a vitamin D3 supplement can have many other benefits besides that. A study of when you look at people who come in the hospital, someone who has a broken hip, about 75% of those people are insufficient in vitamin D, and half our population in the United States is deficient or insufficient in vitamin D, and it has a lot of things to do with muscle strength and depression, general aches and pains. So we probably can't take enough vitamin D in from our food unless you're eating wild salmon 3 days a week. And actually, I'll tell you another interesting thing you're probably aware of is mushrooms. If you put mushrooms in the sun, they'll make vitamin D. Yeah, so if you take your mushrooms even from the store and leave them in the sun, they'll make vitamin D, and then you can eat the mushrooms. They have vitamin D. But you almost cannot get enough vitamin D from diet. You can get enough of most of the other elements from diet.
So, Chad, with regards to calcium, I find it really interesting because, in New Zealand, so they did a review of the recommended dietary intake for calcium, I believe in 2006, and they changed their recommendation from, I believe, 800 to 1,000 milligrams a day, which actually then just placed a whole larger sort of proportion of the population was sort of deficient or had insufficient intakes of calcium, but then to supplement with calcium might not necessarily be. I'm unsure of where the state of the evidence is actually with regards to calcium supplementation and bone, because of course I believe a few years ago there was some concern that taking additional calcium by itself could lead to an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. So where is the evidence for calcium supplementation in of itself?
Well, I'm not a big enthusiast for calcium. After you get over 600 milligrams a day, it really depends on everything else. And so forcing a lot of calcium like I said, that seems like the obvious thing to do. But if you don't have an adequate amount of vitamin D and vitamin K2 and other things, then calcium is not getting to the right place. When you look at DEXA scans, for example, like I said, that's different than looking at fracture rates. And fracture rates actually go up if you're taking more than 2,000 milligrams of calcium a day. So your bones can become too brittle. There's a sweet spot for calcium between 600 and about 1,500 milligrams a day. Now, if you're taking a lot of calcium supplement, you may actually be detrimental because you're making your bone like chalk, and then it becomes more brittle. So I as a medical student, I participated in a research study at the NASA facility in Houston, in which we first determined that high salt diets can leach calcium from your bone, because in order to get rid of salt in your kidneys, it takes calcium with it. And so the astronauts all had a low calcium, low salt diet to help protect their bone from the osteoporosis or weightlessness. I had a chance to discuss that with Commander Lovell, who commanded Apollo 13, and
oh wow,
yeah, and he said, well, we were worried about other things in our bone. That's when they ran out of oxygen. The oxygen tank exploded, and they almost didn't make it back from the moon. But he said we weren't too worried about our bones.
Yeah, they had competing priorities.
Yes, exactly.
I suppose you could call it. Chad, you've mentioned protein as one of the sort of the things that people often overlook with bone, and I do want to chat about collagen as well, because there is a recent rise in sort of collagen supplementation is quite popular. But do you think that the sort of protein intakes have impacted on bone health in the last, or I don't know, however many years? Like, is that impacting on what we see with osteoporosis, osteopenia rates?
That's an excellent point. And it's often so obviously, you say, well, I eat a lot of meat or I eat a lot of stuff, and it's overlooked. So yes, and as we grow older, we tend to eat less protein. I'm constantly after my wife to eat more protein because she just doesn't consume enough. She gets, it satisfies her with a bite or two and she's done. One of the misconceptions, as you know, is that meat itself is not 100% protein. It's only about 50% protein. So you have to have the actual protein, and there's more protein in eggs, and taking collagen and those things. To think collagen's a protein, and it gets into your body and it gets digested, and it breaks it down to the amino acids, and then has to be built back. So to think that you could eat collagen and the collagen goes straight to your bones or your hair or your skin or your nails is a little bit faulty thinking, because the collagen gets digested, it goes through your liver, has to be rebuilt. Now, collagen does have the amino acids that you need for collagen, but it doesn't go straight to your bones. It's just another form of protein. So any type of protein is helpful. Protein supplements, whey protein, those kind of things. So yes, I think most men, but certainly women, tend to be the culprits who don't eat enough protein, more than men. Could use a protein supplement in addition to other things. And that's a good example of how it's not all about vitamin D and calcium. It's the whole mix.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I talk to a lot of vegetarian and vegan clients actually who would really struggle to get the protein that they need.
Yes.
Because because of the sort of exclusion of animal protein, and oftentimes, well, I don't know whether, I'd be interested to know what you think about this, but I recommend that they take like an essential amino drink in addition to the protein that they sort of might eat, just for that increased available amino acids.
Well, vegans, I'm not a vegan, so I'm not as up on that as others, but they do tend to be insufficient in protein and zinc, but other groups aren't. And so if you take zinc oxide, you're not getting it. Magnesium is an important mineral too. We haven't talked about that, but magnesium is more important for the spongy bone, for your spine. It has higher content in your vertebral column, than in your hips. So there are differences there. And the magnesium that's in most things is magnesium oxide, which is only 4% of it gets into your blood. So you could take, so if you're taking magnesium, it should be other forms. And there is milk and there's magnesium in milk and avocados and a lot of different foods.
Although, as I understand, we used to have more magnesium in our food supply, but with the soil and just how things are
True.
growing, or the quality of the soil isn't necessarily as good as it once was either. I imagine.
Well, the stimulation, the way we grow food today, particularly the non-organic foods, have about they have about half the nutritional content. A ear of corn 50 years ago had a lot more nutritional value and maybe less sugar content, but it had more of the soil minerals in it than there are today. The soils have been so overworked, and with the stimulation from the things that make the food grow fast, the fast-growing juicy lettuces and all those things don't have nearly the nutritional content they did before. And even since you bring that up, as you know, farm-raised salmon has considerably less vitamin D than wild-caught salmon.
Yeah, for sure. And what do you have an opinion, Chad, about like the modern diet? Because I always think about food as opportunity cost. And so in addition to the fact that sort of the foods we eat might not contain the nutrients that they once did, in addition to that, a lot of the food we eat is more processed and refined, and could potentially, does the potential inflammatory trigger from some things, is that going to be harmful for our bones, or is inflammation in general harmful for our bones?
I couldn't really comment on inflammation and the diet from the different things that are in it. But one paper, a suggestion has been that part of our obesity crisis is that the foods are the processed foods and the foods that are grown by rapid, large scale production are insufficient in vitamins and minerals. So we may have a nutritional hunger that's unrecognized. Eating, as you know, years ago, people ate all whole grains and whole meats, and they cooked at home, and they had a lot of whole foods. And so you do wonder what's happened. Obesity is probably not all about self-control. It may be about just nutritional insufficiency that makes you hungry for you got to eat more. You got to eat more corn to get the number of vitamins you need.
Yeah,
you got to eat
for sure.
more potatoes, more everything to get adequate nutrition. Another thing about vitamin D is that it's fat soluble, so that if a person is overweight, then the vitamin D often goes straight into their fat, and it's harder for an obese person to get their vitamin D levels up than for a thin person.
Yes, I remember reading that, and it's, here in New Zealand, there's regulation on the amount of vitamin D that we're able to buy over the counter.
Oh, really?
And yeah, so it's 1,000 international units, which I do believe in your paper I was just reading yesterday that's a recommendation could be to have 1,000 international sort of units of vitamin D. And very few supplements, more in the States, because I actually buy a higher dose vitamin D anyway, but very few of the supplements actually have that K2 added, which you were talking about before as being really critical to sort of allowing vitamin D to sort of get to where it needs to be.
Well, taking a boron supplement or eating prunes or dried fruit can, like I say, that can double the half-life of vitamin D so that it lasts longer and you get higher levels. So if you can't get enough vitamin D, then you could supplement yourself with some boron, and that'll make the vitamin D hang around longer and be more higher level. But that's interesting that it's 1,000, because in the United States, what they call the upper safe level is 4,000 international units a day, and in the European Drug Commission says it's 6,000. So it depends on where you are. And the Endocrine Society for the United States recommends 1,500 international units of supplement every day for every human being.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they think that 1,500 supplement is the optimum amount, and it's well within the safe level. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends vitamin D supplementation for all children beginning at 1 month of age. And it's 600 international units for babies. So there's a lot of recommendation, and yet probably only a third of the people in the United States take a vitamin D supplement.
Yeah. Chad, what is the problem with too high vitamin D levels?
Well, if you get extremely high levels, then you do get some problems. It can cause some problems with your endocrine system and so forth. But so you don't want to take too much. But I'm surprised that 1,000 seems kind of low. The recommendation, the general recommendation that came out of the United States Preventive Services Task Force a few years ago, there was a headline that said vitamin D and calcium not good for bone. But when you read the original paper, what it said was that the recommendation for 500 units of vitamin D and 1,000 milligrams of calcium was not adequate. So that we call it the United States Preventive Services Task Force, recommended 1,200 international units of vitamin D a day. So they didn't say it wasn't good. They said you weren't giving enough. And that the studies that were done with 500 or 800 units were not enough, that you needed to give 12. And then they also recommended 500 milligrams of calcium a day, because you're getting calcium from other things. And I really think 500 milligrams a day supplement we're talking about of calcium is enough.
Yes. So outside of dairy products, if someone is intolerant to dairy and can't have it, where else would we find calcium in the diet?
No, if you can't eat dairy, I'd be hard pressed. I'd have to look at that to see. So if you can't eat dairy, then you should take some extra. That's for sure. So if you're lactose intolerant, then it would make sense to take it. We become more lactose intolerant as we age. Most babies make lactase, which is to just milk. And as we get older, we find that the processed foods like yogurt, cheese, and have the lactose has been altered a little bit so we can tolerate it better. And there's plenty of calcium in lactose-free milk, which you can get.
Yeah, that's true. For sure. And
there is in nuts.
Yes, and in fact, what I've seen someone recommend is egg shells that you make into a dust, actually, and that's got a significant amount of calcium. I've not tried that myself with my egg shells, but the actual shells.
What kind
of these are egg shells. So just crack open an egg, eat the egg, ground down the shell. Yeah, eat the calcium, eat the shell.
I don't know.
Okay. And I think innovative.
The shells probably have silicon in them because there's silicon in bamboo and some other stuff. But
yes,
bamboo
of course,
shoots.
Yes.
Things.
I often I think about Asian countries where they don't consume a lot of dairy, but there are some Asian countries which have sort of fermented tofu, like tempeh might have some K2 added actually, but they have this thing called natto,
right,
which is and I believe that's a very good source of K2, which is going to be helpful with the little amount of calcium that you might get from bones and fish and things like that.
Right. Now K2, to talk about that a little bit, there's K1 and K2, and K1 is the vitamin K that's in leafy green vegetables, and that's different. That's different from K2. They're really two completely different vitamins. And if you talk to your orthopedic surgeon and you're on Coumadin or some blood thinner, they may say, well, don't take vitamin K because it'll interfere with coagulation. But K2 doesn't interfere with coagulation, so you can take it. And K2 is, if K2 is rich, it's rich in dark meat of turkey and chicken, the dark meat, and it's rich in dairy products made from grass-fed cows. So butter, and it's fat soluble, so you can eat butter now. But the butter from grass-fed cows is the best. And what happens is K1 is in leafy green vegetables. And there's a gut microbiome or gut organisms that convert K1 to K2. And so if you've taken antibiotics, you're not going to convert K1 to K2. And that's important for bone healing. So if you've had antibiotics after surgery or something like that, then you definitely want to restore your gut microbiome. But what happens is the cows eat grass and they convert K1 to K2 and put it in the milk and in the butter. But the grain-fed cows don't have any K1 to work with. So
interesting, of course.
Yeah. So you can get a lot of K2 from butter. So now you're going to have to drink beer and eat rich butter. And the French, for example, have a lot of artisanal cheeses and things like that. And most of their butters and cheeses are made from grass-fed cows, the better ones, more expensive ones. And there's France has a very low risk of osteoporosis and heart disease compared to the rest of the world. It's considerably less common in France. They also have a lot of silicated water and more K2 in their diets. They eat a lot of butter. You would think that butter would cause heart attacks, but the K2 actually improves your resistance to heart attacks as well as your resistance to fractures. So there's a lot of reasons to take K2. Now, K2 is hard to process into a pill form. So it requires an oily thing like vitamin D3. So most of your vitamin supplements don't put K2 in it because it's expensive. It's very expensive, and it's hard to put into a capsule. Along with other things, you can make it like vitamin D often comes as a specific gel capsule.
Yeah,
it doesn't. Yeah. There's some in other ones, but it's hard to process. So anyway, K2 is very interesting to me, like silicon. So it's hard to get those. And those are just two that drink your beer and eat your butter.
Eat your butter. You're a doctor I can get behind, Chad. That's excellent advice. And then, of course, one other topic which I'd just love to hear your opinion on is, of course, exercise. Because, we are an increasingly sedentary population. But as it's such an important part of maintaining our health and longevity. And I wonder just how much our lack of activity is playing into these increasing sort of rates of osteopenia and osteoporosis. So do we have information around that?
Absolutely. No, I mean, I think that's quite clear. And you're right on target with that. The question is what type of exercise? And surprisingly, walking is not all that great for your bones.
Interesting.
Walking's not that great for your bones. People that run a lot tend to get nutritionally deficient in boron and magnesium in particular. But what you need is the compressive exercise. And there's an exercise that's simple to do that has been shown to increase bone density, and that is called a heel drop, where you stand up on your tiptoes, and then you drop down and land kind of hard and just sort of jolt yourself a little bit on the ground so that you get a compression. Now, you don't want to jolt yourself so much that you get a compression fracture of your spine, but you jar yourself a little bit. So you raise up on your toes and just kind of let go and drop as much as you can tolerate. And if you do 50 of those a day or even 3 times a week, it improves your bone density. So it doesn't require a lot.
So skipping would be an option.
Stepping.
Then that's essentially skipping, like with a skip rope.
Exactly.
With a jump rope.
Skipping, jumping, those kind of things are better. Walking's good. Don't get me wrong. Walking's great, but but swimming and those kind of things, there are better exercises. Tennis is really good for bones. Those kind of the stop start kind of things. The mechanism in our walking,
Yeah, and I understand that resistance training with the stress that sort of stresses the bone and muscle and that tension between the two tissue is bone strengthening as well.
Right. All the exercises that use your muscles compress the bone. So any exercise is good. And as the physical therapists say, if it's physical, it's therapy. And so
I love it.
If it's physical, it's therapy. So there's a lot of truth to that.
Yeah. Chad, now, can I ask, your wife's osteoporosis, like, have you been able to sort of determine the progression of that over the years with the things that you've helped her put in place?
Well, interestingly, I have other relatives too, and one who had severe osteoporosis had 5 fractures, fragility fractures. We call them, my sister-in-law, and but since she's been working on the nutrition that I told her about for the last 8 or 9 years, she calls me regularly and says, I took a horrible fall yesterday. I had to go to the hospital and get stitches, but I didn't break anything. And so there's a lot of anecdotal information that the bone density, my wife's bone density has not changed. It has not gotten better. It's not gotten worse. But she's also taken some falls and not broken anything. So once again, the DEXA scan is an artificial measurement. It is a measurement of the calcium content of your bone, but it doesn't tell you the toughness or resiliency of your bone. So the answer is there's not a real way to tell if you're improving. But if you will do those things and try to take some, in addition to calcium and vitamin D, they're critically important. But if you do some other things too, like the silicon, the vitamin K2, some boron, there's something called inositol that we haven't talked
I've
about.
heard of inositol.
Inositol
No, yes.
used to be called vitamin B3, but we can manufacture inositol a little bit. And what inositol does is it facilitates transfer of calcium across cell membranes. So animals, that's again why 500 milligrams of calcium is enough if you take some inositol. And I forget what it's in. It's in cantaloupe, and I think it's in some other. It's not much in our diet actually, but you can buy it, myo-inositol. You don't need a lot.
Yeah, myo-inositol.
Yeah, but it improves the mineralization of bone. There are studies in experimental animals that show that if you give an animal vitamin D and calcium and inositol, the inositol improves their mineralization by 44%. So the ones that don't,
That's amazing.
the ones that don't get inositol, and our diets tend to be inadequate in inositol. So if you add some silicon in the water, some vitamin K2, whether it's butter or supplement, and some inositol, some boron. Those are 4 things that you could add that will help. And there are other things too, and those improve your bone resistance, your resistance to fractures. It might not improve your DEXA scan, but it'll make it so you can bounce better.
And that's the thing, right? That you might not see it on the scan, but if you fall and you don't get a break, then that is proof in itself that these dietary strategies are contributing to better bone health, even if you can't see it.
So if you look at absolute fracture rate, the fracture rate goes down when you do these things, even though the bone density may not go down. And another thing for you, you've had a fracture of a minor bone and probably was a significant fall. But on the other hand, anyone who's had a fracture after the age of 25 has an incredibly increased risk of additional fracture, because when you heal a broken bone, it takes minerals from your other bones to heal it.
Yes.
So if someone breaks their leg, you can measure a loss of calcium in the opposite leg while that one's healing. So anyone who has a broken hip on one side has a much, much higher risk of broken hip on the other. It's not just because they're at risk, it's because their other hip loses density. So I would say that any of your listeners who've had a broken bone need to really take their bone health seriously. If you've never had a broken bone, you're better off. But that first one can create a cascade effect that generates additional broken bones.
Yeah, and that is definitely something that was in my mind when I was researching and getting all the things, being the best student ever, actually, for helping with so all of the supplements that you mentioned, other than inositol, I'm just taking because I figure now's the time to do this whilst I'm healing. Yeah.
Well, and it's never too late. It would be better to start when you're a teenager for sure. But it's kind of hard to go back and do that for most of us.
Yeah. So, but you can look forward. You're right. It's there is a point in time when it is too late, but we're not going to know about that.
But you can make a big difference in adulthood. The literature is quite clear that if you do these things as an adult, that you can decrease your fracture risk. And of course, the other thing, if we're talking about fractures, is to, fracture proof your house, get rid of the throw rugs, make sure you've got some light at night. You can do some balancing exercises, simple balancing exercises, or just practice standing on one leg, practice getting up out of a chair without pushing or holding on. When you're standing around, try to stand on one leg as long as you can, or stand on the other leg. You can practice your balance in simple ways.
And I feel like, Chad, you've given people plenty of those practical tips, but also hope as well, because when someone gets a diagnosis of osteopenia, osteoporosis, it can feel you can feel a little bit hopeless, actually. So to know that there are steps you can take that helps delay progression and potentially improve, I feel like that's really encouraging.
Yeah. If you do have a fracture, like a hip fracture, there's some, not all doctors do this, but you mentioned the 1,000 unit level, but they should, if you have a fracture and you go in the hospital, they ought to measure your vitamin D level at the same time. And following a hip fracture, the women who've had an infusion in the hospital of 50,000 units of vitamin D do better long term than the ones that didn't. So,
amazing.
The vitamin D is clearly something that can help that if you've had a fracture.
Yeah, that is amazing, Chad. Thank you. So, finally, you are a wealth of information. I really enjoyed reading your papers around bone health, and really, I learned a lot. Can you let people know where they can find you on the internet? And of course, we'll pop it in the show notes as well.
Wow. I don't know if there is a place, quite frankly.
I'm not sure how I found you, actually.
Well, years
I think
ago, all right, I'll tell you the story, but I didn't want to promote a product. But years ago, because of all this, I had bottles of different things for my wife. And so I created a product that had all those things in it. And we created a nutritional supplement company. And I did have a financial interest. And my goal, actually, I'd taken it to a number of companies and said, look, here's a product that will help people with bone health. Will you make it? And I couldn't get anyone to do it. And so some orthopedic friends of mine, we put some money together and we made a product. We had it produced. We had a website, and we sold it. And when the company became profitable, not fabulously wealthy, but once it reached a profitable break point, we were able to turn it over to another company that's continued to sell that product. And
amazing.
And that company is Divine Health. It's called Silical, Silical. And
Yes.
All that information is on the website. So when we turned it over to them, I said, this has been maybe 7 or 8 years ago. They still sell it. And it's called Dr. Colbert's product, which is fine.
Yes.
And it's fine with me. I got what I wanted out of it, that my wife has a product, my friends have a product, we have a product, and I don't get any money or any credit, and that's fine with me. I really did have altruistic interest in putting that out there. It's expensive because it's hard to make those things. So It's an expensive product, but that website, I think it's still called the Institute for Better Bone Health. The Institute for Better Bone Health.
Yeah.
Maybe where you found it. It's operated by Divine Health.
Yeah, I think that is.
I may still be on it, or maybe all about Dr. Colbert now, but it's the Institute for Better Bone Health. And
amazing.
So I'm not in the business. I've got other things to do.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Chad, thank you so much for your time this morning. I really appreciated talking to you, and I've learned so much from your work, and I really thank you for that. So thank you.
Well, I appreciate what you're doing and bringing this information to the public. It's so important for health.
Yeah, completely
Thank
agree.
you so much. I've enjoyed talking to you. Bye-bye.
Alrighty, so I came across Dr. Price, as I'm sure that you can appreciate, after I broke my bone earlier this year. So it was really great to do a bit of a deep dive and sort of check off a lot of the things that I'm doing in relation to some of his recommendations. So yeah, it was a really good opportunity to do that. All right, team. So you have a great week. And next week on the podcast, I speak to Tommy Wood, who has been on the show before. This time we talk about brain health. So that'll be a great interview. Until next week though, you can catch me over on Facebook at Mikki Williden Nutrition, over on Instagram and Twitter at Mikki Williden, or head to my website mickywilliden.com, where you can sign up to one of my meal plans or book a one-on-one call with me. All right, team, you have a great week. Talk soon. Bye.